You're listening to The Dead Prussian, a podcast about war and warfare.
I was thinking the other day about Imperial Rome, Imperial Britain, and the idea of having colonial military forces control other people's territory for your own needs. But not all colonial forces have been used for what some people might consider pure realist objectives. Sometimes they're used for altruistic purposes, or sometimes they're used for a blend of the both. Why has this got me interested in a podcast about war? Well, you'll find that a lot of the regions where colonial powers have operated in the past get riven by conflict. They become hotspots for conflict. There used to be a saying, if you control Syria, you control the Roman Empire. Very, very interesting. But we're not talking about Syria today. G'day listeners, it is your host here, the humblest host you'll find on a podcast named after a dead Prussian military theorist. I have managed to sneak my way back into the Australian War Memorial. That's not a criticism of their security, which is actually very, very, very good. It's actually a compliment to my own sneaking skills. The way I did this was I got in contact with someone who works here and said, can I have a chat? My guest today knows a lot about colonial forces being used, but knows a lot about colonial forces being used in ways that you may not fully appreciate. It is Dr. Tristan Moss, and he completed his PhD at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre, an excellent school running an excellent program that some people may be involved in right now, at the Australian National University in 2015. His book, Guarding the Periphery, the Australian Army in Papua New Guinea, 1951 to 1975, was published this year by Cambridge University Press. In 2013 to 14, Dr. Moss co-authored with Professor Joan Beaumont the Thai-Burma Railway and Hellfire Pass, Australian Prisoners of War on the Thai-Burma Railway, 1942 to 1945. Now that was written for the Department of Veterans Affairs, and it's a particular topic that a lot of Australians probably have a lot of cultural knowledge about, but I suggest you read this particular publication because it probably dispels a lot of the myths you might have heard from the RSL bar. He was a teaching fellow at the Australian Command and Staff College in 2016, so he missed out on being one of my supervisors by a year. And he worked on both the Serving Our Country project, investigating Indigenous service in the Australian Defence Force, and the official history of peacekeeping, humanitarian, post-Cold War operations. So as you can see, Tristan is very much a rich topic area for me to data mine. Tristan, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mick.
Now, before we start discussing colonial forces and going down the rabbit hole that I've promised the listeners we'll get into, with most guests, I'm interested in their journey. So can you tell us a little bit about how you became a military historian?
I always find that an interesting question to answer because a lot of people answer with with a personal narrative about their grandfather served or something like that. Now, for some reason, the Moss family managed to skip a lot of wars. My grandfather was too young to serve in the Second World War, and Dad's certainly too young to have served in the Vietnam War. So I don't really have one of those sort of personal narratives about why I'm interested in the military, why I became a military historian. For me, it's about understanding the how of things. That's what always drew to me to be a historian.
Yeah.
And if you want to understand the how of something, you go to the big organisations. So something like the military. I mean, it's so complex. There's so much to understand there. I just find that really attractive. And I think there's lots of work to be done in explaining that complexity. Garth Pratton, someone at the SDSC, which I saw you talked up.
Been through a few lectures with Garth. Actually have to get him on the show.
Yeah, you should, definitely. One of the best historians I know. But he has a great quote where he says, to say a company took a hill by fire and movement is akin to saying that heart transplants are a process of taking the heart out and putting a new one in. Well, it's not that simple, is it? And so I really want to get to that sort of how of things. That's why I like military history.
Okay. But I'm pretty sure a heart transplant is taking a heart out and putting it in.
I'm a doctor. I can do that if you're free afterwards.
You are a doctor. You're one of those doctors that if someone says on an aeroplane, is there a doctor on the plane? Just keep your hand down. Sure. Although you could save someone's life by history.
I could explain the history of their ailments while they are choked to death or something.
Yeah, it's very comforting for them, I'm sure. Now, I want to talk about discussing the concept of colonial military forces before we get into our case study on PNG. because some people may not know much about colonial military forces and they may think that they're simply occupation forces. So can you tell us a little bit about what colonial military forces are and what they're used for?
Of course. I mean, I would start by saying that colonial military forces have existed for the same thousands of years as normal military forces, for want of a term. The Romans used them.
Yep.
So you've got auxiliaries. They're essentially colonial military forces. The French used them in Egypt. Obviously, the big empires like the British had local troops.
Yep.
The archetype of this being India.
Yeah.
So you've got groups of the Indian army, so Sikhs and Gurkhas, to name the most famous ones. And often, again, using India, they're used as a force of colonial control. So these are the days before large police forces, and so you'd use your regiment of Sikhs to control the local population. And at the same time, these soldiers were quite cheap. So you'd much rather hire 5 Indian soldiers than you would pay 1 British soldier who you'd have to ship out from Great Britain, who would probably die of malaria before he even got off the boat. Those sort of things. Whereas you can pay an Indian soldier a fifth of the cost. But because these forces were so often sort of conceptualised in terms of race, so the particular idea about the capabilities of a soldier, maybe they wouldn't be able to stand up to particular amounts of fire, or they wouldn't take direction the same way that a European soldier would be, or they couldn't serve in certain climates. What this did, and I'm simplifying here, but what this did was create or force colonial powers to come up with ideas of classification of indigenous soldiers, of colonial soldiers. And this is where the famous martial races idea comes through. So again, Sikhs are a martial race. Gurkhas are still considered this sort of great fighting force. Or Maori people, or even the Scots have been considered a martial race.
Now, that's just because they like fighting. And you put them in uniform.
You can debate how martial a race can be if they wear dresses to the end of time. But,
that's right.
But in fact,
for everyone from Two Scots who I served with, that's Tristan's point of view. I believe they're skirts.
So it led to this idea of martial races, and there were particular groups that were privileged within these colonial forces. But these, while still sort of quite commonly talked about, these forces did tend to be fake. They tend to be made up. This idea of particular groups being martial. Often it was economic reasons. Certain groups were recruited. Sometimes it was because a particular group had fallen out of favour. So the soldiers from the Bengal region after the Indian Mutiny in 1857 weren't recruited because they were considered to be disloyal. And then so the Sikhs, who had only recently been conquered and sort of assimilated into the empire, they were recruited. But it became quite a powerful force in how we see indigenous armies. And then you see it being applied to somewhere like Papua New Guinea, or you see it being applied to, say, Maori battalions in this First and Second World War. And then assimilated within these groups' identity as proof that they contribute to society or things like that. So colonial forces have been used throughout history, but also sort of developed this sort of aura of martiality among certain groups that has been sort of taken on by these groups and also sort of promulgated by colonial forces, and then just often popular literature since.
That's interesting, considering you look at the Indian troops fought in the First and Second World War for the British, big legends behind them. Gurkhas, having served in a brigade that had some Gurkhas attached in Helmand, that martial prowess still exists. So it's really interesting to see how some of it may be a cultural attribution as opposed to a factual reality. You mentioned Papua New Guinea. Your PhD was on Papua New Guinean forces, the colonial forces, and your book that's mentioned before, and I'll re-advertise it at the end so everyone listens to this and goes, wow, that's super interesting, let's get the book. Please buy the book. It helps all my guests out and it makes them more willing to come on the show. But this was on Australia's colonial forces in Papua New Guinea. Can you give us a quick overview on these forces and the purpose of these forces?
Sure. I mean, most people know about the military in Papua New Guinea from the Second World War.
Yep.
When we think of PNG, we think of two things, I think. We think of Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels,
Yep.
so that famous picture, and well, everyone thinks it's the Kokoda track, but it's actually near Boona.
Okay. I have learned something.
There you go.
Even though it was in your article as well that I read today.
Oh, everyone should read that article in the
They
conversation as well. But the famous picture for the listeners is a picture of a Papua New Guinean helping an Australian soldier who's been wounded, obviously away from the front lines to get medical treatment. And so we either think about that particular picture, I think, and also PNG being sort of that unstable neighbour to Australia. That's, I think, the two things. Coups and Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels is what we think about Papua New Guinea. So, as I mentioned, Papua New Guinea's military history starts in the Second World War. We raised a group of native soldiers, what they were called at the time, the Papuan Infantry Battalion in 1940. And that served on the Kokoda track. And that did reasonably well as the rest of all the other Australian soldiers did. Right. It retreated like the rest of them. And it was used essentially as scouting troops, as reconnaissance troops, and then also sort of to guard key points, hospitals, water tanks, that sort of stuff away from the front line, and to free up the police to go back to sort of colonial policing duties. So that was the idea behind the raising of the PIB. And it did well enough, and the scouts were useful enough, that the NGIB, the New Guinea Infantry Battalions, were raised a couple of years later. And then these were grouped, there were 4 NGIBs and 1 PIB. These were grouped under the aegis of the Pacific Islands Regiment in 1944 or 45, if memory serves. So they served in every campaign as scouts did reasonably well. They actually racked up the highest kill ratio of Japanese soldiers. So they killed far more Japanese soldiers than they lost themselves, and far more than any other Australian unit.
Oh, wow.
Because they were constantly being used. Now, these fellows were disbanded in 1947, partly in response to the sort of general demobilisation of the Australian Army. We went from, 6 or 7 divisions to 3 battalions at the end of the war. But also because of this fear of arming the natives, for want of a better term. This idea that you have a trained body of local people who have access to weapons, and that's a threat.
Especially if they've got the highest kill ratio too.
Exactly. And they would go back to their villages and they would have no one sort of watching them. And there's this idea that this would be a threat to Australian colonialism. And Australia had been in charge of Papua and New Guinea since 1883, and then 1914 for New Guinea. And there were very few Australians in the territory. So that's World War II. That's the background. That's not what I deal with in my book. So my book starts in 1951. So in the context of the Cold War, basically PNG had no military forces in it. There was a naval base at Manus Island, and that was it. And so there was this fear that World War III was coming soon. You've got communist China, you've got Russia. And then you've got Indonesia, newly created Indonesia, sort of being coveting West Papua.
It wasn't a very turbulent time for Indonesia, the 50s and 60s, I'm sure. So.
It was fine. So we re-raised the PIR, the Pacific Islands Regiment. And that's essentially a copy of how it was during the Second World War. It was seen as an auxiliary, it was seen as scouts. They weren't given machine guns, they weren't considered capable of using them, they weren't given mortars. And they were used as scouts. And then essentially that expanded during Confrontation, which I can talk more about later, and then became the basis of the Papua New Guinea Defence Force. But that's the background of how it started. Okay,
it's interesting. For some listeners that don't know, talk about Papua and New Guinea. They were 2 separate, I suppose you could call them provinces. Now they're Papua New Guinea, the nation. So there's some people I find don't know that. You now know that. Tristan has educated us. It's really, really interesting how you talk about how successful they were as fighters, and then they get disbanded. It's just, sometimes you just want to go back in history and say, look what they just did, look what they just did. Are you sure? What sort of operations did, and let's talk post-1951 now, because this is not a World War II chat, this is a Colonial Forces in Papua New Guinea chat. So what sort of operations did these forces conduct, and how are they structured to carry out these types of operations?
Well, I suppose there's 2 parts to that. I mean, there's the 1950s part and the 1960s part. So the 1950s part, which I'll deal with first, is when they were essentially a colonial army. Now, remember, this was when no Papua New Guinean could rise above the rank of sergeant. Purely because of racial reasons. All the officers were white. and as I say, they weren't considered capable of dealing with the sort of more modern weapons and tactics, and indeed weren't included in being clerks and things like that. So in the 1950s, they were very much seen as being the vanguard of any Australian force.
Okay.
So the idea that the PIR, which consisted of one battalion, was the tripwire, and then once the Chinese, the Indonesians, the men from Mars invaded PNG, they would fall back, and then we would send regular battalions.
So they were the 39th Battalion of the 50s and 60s.
Exactly, yeah. And so, and then once the Australian regular forces arrived, they would sort of range in front of those battalions, acting as almost intermediaries between not only these regular battalions fighting with regular weapons and trucks and things like that, and the enemy, but also intermediaries between these European-style battalions and the jungle, and the idea of the jungle being a sort of a different environment to fight with, and they would be guides and things like that. And then during the 1960s, they expanded in response to confrontation, and as did the entire Australian Army, to essentially a brigade-sized force. So 2 battalions with the hope of raising a third under PNG command, which was raised in 1965. And by that time, because of the sort of broader social shifts in PNG, Papua New Guineans were no longer as racially sort of discriminated against. So, for instance, they were allowed to wear the soldiers were allowed to wear shoes from 1962. They were allowed to wear shirts when they were training. Those sorts of things. And this is quite a different time. Those sort of things started to be dismantled. And then that was reflected in the way they were used as soldiers. So they were structured more as a regular battalion. They had machine guns and mortars. And their job essentially was to act almost like the SAS, not as sort of elite, although they did train with the SAS, but range in sort of platoon-sized patrols along the border and act as the first barrier that would fall back because you're only a platoon. Report back, and then once it was clear that there was an invasion underway, start to engage in sort of jungle warfare in concert with Australian battalions, and this the sort of equality was shown by the fact that they were just going to rotate battalions through. So Royal Australia Regiment was going to rotate with PIR as needed. So they were considered interchangeable.
That's excellent. And just to clarify for the listeners, the border you're talking about is the border between West Papua and Papua New Guinea, and West Papua was annexed by Indonesia in Confrontation.
In 1962, that's right. And it's the first time and the only time Australia shared a land border with any country.
Yeah, interesting. And so for those people that are looking up books on it, Confrontation also commonly written about in the Bahasa word, which is confrontasi. So it's actually really, really interesting for Australians to learn more about it, because if you don't learn about confrontation, then, as Tristan said, there's a fair bit of our history that you're missing when we had our only land border. Now, that takes us through the 50s and 60s. I'm guessing, because your book goes to 1975, when we go to the 70s, we're going into a transition period. So my penultimate question, which everyone on the show who listens to it knows that's my big word for saying my second last question. You know that. Lots of my listeners don't, because they're really obtuse. This question's regarding transition. So was the transition from being a colonial force to an indigenous force, given, you've just said they became interchangeable, they're seen as a very high-quality force, Was this smooth, and how did it work for the PNG forces? Was it good?
It was smooth to a certain degree. Now, we've got to place this in context. I mean, in 1950, Paul Hasluck, the Minister for External Territories, who was in charge of PNG, said PNG won't be independent for another 100 years. That was in 1950. In 1965, 1966, the Australian Cabinet was meeting and saying, look, independence is probably still 20 years away. Let's not make a decision. And so that's the sort of environment that the army was operating.
They weren't very accurate.
No, they weren't very accurate at all. But also, because they didn't know how long it would take, they didn't start preparing. And so that's part of the issue. So there's always these great debates about, did we leave PNG in general too early? And partly it's about the timetable that was set down. So for the army, that was very vague. But what's really interesting, and what my book argues, is that by the late 60s, once Confrontasi had ended, the army, under, in particular the brigadier in charge of PNG Command, Ian Hunter, starts thinking about independence independently of the Australian government. So the Australian government hasn't said, you guys start thinking about what happens when these guys have their own defence force. They just go, well, clearly the writing's on the wall. Let's start doing it off our own bat with our own resources. And so what we see is an influx of educational Royal Australian Army Education Corps teachers.
Yep.
They become the second largest corps in PNG after the infantry.
Yep.
Teaching Papua New Guineans how to be good soldiers but also good citizens.
Yep.
And so this idea that everyone's seeing what's happening in Africa. Everyone's seeing the various coups in the 1960s as independence sort of rolls through that continent. And they want to avoid that. And so education is seen as one of these things. And this is done while the Australian Army in PNG is still considered an integral part of the army in Australia on the mainland. While Vietnam's still going on, while it's very much supposedly a Cold War focused force, but nonetheless internally and by itself is starting to prepare for independence. But once the 70s roll around, basically someone flips a switch and goes, right, independence in a couple of years. Off you go. And so this mad scramble. So what you see is that 3rd Battalion just gets cut from the order of battle because they don't have enough time. In someone like Ted Diro, the first Papua New Guinean to receive a commission in 1963. So in 1963 he's a 2nd lieutenant. By 1974 he's a brigadier. It's that quick.
Wow.
And so this happens writ large.
He's much better at his job than mine.
Yeah. Well, they say war's really good for promotion, but so is decolonisation. And so the point I'm trying to get to is that it's largely the timetable's out of the army's hand.
Yeah.
But it does quite well in preparing because it sees the writing on the wall and is given the leeway, is given the rope by AHQ, Army Headquarters in Canberra, to do what it needs to do.
Yep.
We can't talk about whether it did well. Implied in your question is this idea that the PNGDF hasn't done very well since. We've got things like Bougainville and the fact that it's downsized. At independence, it was 3,500 people in the force. Now it's about 2,000 or less.
Yeah.
But I think there's only so much blame that can be laid at the foot of Australians. I think it has to be seen in the context of PNG as a nation state from 1975 to now. And that's giving them credit, I would say, that they made their own decisions. They decided to a certain degree not to fund the military to the same degree that we did. And that's why some of these things have happened, not this idea that it's all our fault, because that takes agency away from Papua New Guineans. But what I would say to close out the question is that the Army of Papua New Guinea, PNG Command, by 1975 had decades of experience in the jungle, had actively patrolled against Indonesians while not firing any shots, had been quite close to war, and they understood what was going on. I mean, we were fighting Indonesians in Malaysia at the time. So that was, they were almost operational, and had been integral parts of the Australian Army. And my favourite fact, perhaps it's a good place to end, is that in 1972, 1 in 10 of the regular Australian Army was Papua New Guinean. 1 in 10.
That is excellent. Having quite a few friends in the Papua New Guinea Defence Force, some of the best blokes around, it's great to know this history. So for a lot of listeners out there, I don't know much about this, which is why I wanted to interview Tristan. Also, he's just a good bloke. But that's an interesting fact because it shows the recent history. I mean, this is not that long ago. It's just interesting. I think people should buy your book and read it because I'm going to the launch as well. I think that'll be really cool. But I do have one more question for you because everyone has to answer this question. So we're going to move on from Colonial Forces. We'll move on from PNG, although quite frankly I'd love to sit here and just talk about this history for ages because PNG is very, very interesting. Having spent a lot of time in North Queensland, you get to do a lot of work with their army, and for people who have a rather paternalistic view of our regional neighbours, no matter where you are in the world, work with your regional neighbours and you'll probably find that they're not as... your expectations of them are probably actually exceeded. Once you start working with them, you realise that they're pretty professional. But professionalism actually doesn't belong anywhere on this show. So Tristan, although you can be professional if you like, it's my role to be unprofessional. I have a final question for you. I ask this of all guests. This is the dreaded question. This is the question that after 44 episodes, 45 episodes, whatever we're up to, it's getting tough for people to answer. Mainly because I start getting a lot of historians on the show, and historians tend to drift towards the same definitions. But it relates to the mission on the show, which is to define war in as many ways possible, like Big Carl, the dead Prussian, did, so that our continuing conversation about war and its impact on society evolves and is current. So every guest gets to finish the sentence, war is. So, Tristan, can you please finish the sentence, war is?
Now, I want to take this somewhere which I hope is a new direction for you.
Yeah, if it's not, we'll just say it is.
Sure. I want to say that war is not the only game in town.
Oh, nice.
And that's basically to say that we should look at, like my research does, what militaries do in peacetime and sort of blur those lines between war and peacetime. If, for example, the patrolling the border during the 1960s against Indonesia, while it wasn't a war, was still a very important focus of the Australian Army during that period.
Yeah.
So we tend to focus on somewhere like Vietnam, but not on what the Army was doing elsewhere. And I suppose, to put it another way, as we engage in long-term, not wars or long-term low-intensity conflicts.
Whatever the term is for it today, it will be different tomorrow anyway.
Exactly. I think we need to broaden our definition of what militaries do. And that's not just war. Of course, it's peacekeeping. Of course, it's aid to the civil power. It's humanitarian operations.
Maintain relationships with regional neighbours, continue training and development.
Exactly. And someone did a very good conference on this not too long ago.
Yeah, that's right.
There'll be a good book coming out.
Wonder who they are. That's for another episode later on, once that book's ready.
Indeed. But I suppose, Tom Richardson, who came on the show a while back, him and I have sort of had this great discussion about that particular conference and defining military history. Now, I actually think military history is a great term for what we do because it doesn't relate to war per se.
It's not war history.
Exactly. It relates to what militaries do. And I think we tend to see military history like it is war history, but I think it's much broader than that. I think we should understand what militaries do, why they exist, how they exist, and who exists within them. And so that would be my answer. I think we need to broaden out from looking at war.
War is not the only game in town. And the best thing about that, for those Twitter lovers out there, it's nice and short and we can use it on Twitter. Right, so people, you've heard about PNG, you've heard about the Colonial Forces, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, transitions that the Colonial Forces went through, but you're not going to understand that if you don't read Tristan's book. So get out there, buy Guarding the Periphery, the Australian Army in Papua New Guinea, 1951 to 1975. And that's published by Cambridge University Press, so jump on their website if you want to buy it from them. Jump on Amazon, Booktopia, their book depository. I saw them available on all of those. And until one of those sponsors the show, I'll keep mentioning all of them. You can also find Tristan on Twitter at Tristan Moss. He is involved in the Official History Project, and if you are an Australian service member or veteran, you served, you're doing Afghanistan, is that correct?
Yeah, and we're also doing Iraq and East Timor.
Iraq and East Timor as well. So get in contact with the Official History Project at the War Memorial. Give them your take on your service, and that is part and parcel of going into the collective memory and history of what the Australian Defence Force has been doing on operations. Tristan, thanks very much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, listeners, apart from that, jump across to War for Idiots every off week, so you'll notice the shows are staggered now so that the studio has a chance to produce both shows, basically so I can sleep. And War for Idiots, a little bit of a dumbered down version, a lot more toilet humour on some of these issues, more of the theory than the history. But until next time, listeners, grab a book and crack on.
Join the conversation with us on Twitter at Dead Prussian Pod, on Facebook at the Dead Prussian page, or on our website www.thedeadprussian.com. All show notes for this episode, as well as copyright information, can be found on the website. The Dead Prussian podcast is written, produced and hosted by Mick Cook. It is co-produced by Amanda Levito. The music used throughout is Caught in the Beat by Broke for Free and is used under a Creative Commons Attribution license. All opinions expressed by individuals on the podcast are those of the individual and not necessarily representative of any other organisation.